Greetings, everyone. My name is Amy Antonucci. I'm a New Hampshire Peace Action Board member, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our Peace and Justice Conversation Series online on October 23rd, 2023. For those of you who are new, I want to let you know that for more than 40 years now, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all, based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict. In that spirit of respect, I would like to take a moment to share with you a land acknowledgement, to note that we are doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the people who have lived in connection throughout the generations. I want to give you a quick reminder on Zoom etiquette. We love it when you have your video on, although we know, given that we're recording, not everyone is comfortable with that. But we do ask that you keep your audio muted unless we call on you. We're mostly going to use the chat for questions, though later on we can have probably time for some hand raising. But you can be using that chat all along. I also want to mention that some of the topics we're going to get into tonight are ones that bring up strong feelings for people. And we just ask that you remain respectful and treat each other with dignity. We will go ahead and mute people if there's behavior such as yelling or swearing that seems disrespectful. We want everyone to be engaged and heard, but we also have a commitment to making everyone feel safe here. So tonight, our topic is possibilities for peace in the post-Cold War era. We are welcoming Joseph Gerson again. We have had him before, and he always brings us so much wisdom. He's the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, the convener of Peace and Planet International Network, and co-chair of the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. He works closely with peace organizations and people across the U.S., Asia Pacific, and Europe. He's written many excellent books, including Empire and the Bomb: How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World. And I'm going to turn it over to him. He'll be sharing some thoughts with us, 20 to 30 minutes, and then we're going to go to Q&A and discussion. And remember, you can start using the chat right away, and I'll be compiling questions. But for now, let's give a visible welcome to Joseph, who we're so happy to have with us.
So thank you, Amy. I want to thank you for inviting me, and Doreen for carrying the tech on this. And then also, just to say it's a delight to see a number of old friends. And a couple of them, a few of them go back, my memory, to the founding of New Hampshire Peace Action, when it spun off from the American Friends Service Committee in New Hampshire. So just to really appreciate, friends joining, and I apologize for what will be a little bit of a one-way conversation when I'd love to be in a reunion, but we'll run with that. As you saw from the slide that Amy posted to begin with, when she and I first corresponded about this, the idea was to kind of share lessons from too much travel this spring and summer to Vienna for an international peace summit around Ukraine, and then to Korea and Japan. And of course, excuse the cursing, but all hell is blown up since then. And so I thought I'll try and cover a number of things in too short a period of time. Just to go back a little bit, the Biden national security statement, issued now a couple of years ago, states near the beginning that the post-Cold War is clearly over, and that the struggle to shape the future is on among the great powers. And Fiona Hill, who we know from Ukraine fame, national security advisor, staffer, has been very clear that the period of Pax Americana is over. And it's a struggle for power and privilege going on in the world. And when you have a situation where an empire or a hegemon is weakened, then a lot of contending forces try to fill the vacuum, and it's gotten pretty bloody. I've been pulling in about 4 directions at once, which drives me a little bit crazy. But just to say, and I'll speak to each of these areas. The Israel-Gaza war, the continuing war in Ukraine, the growing and continuing tensions between the United States and China, and then the reality of the continuing nuclear arms races and nuclear weapons, saber rattling, and so on. So there's a lot happening. One wants to be a source of hope, and I do my best. I'm sometimes maybe too optimistic, but I think we also need to deal with the reality that we're in a hard time, and this hard time is going to continue for a period of time. And we therefore have a responsibility to be doing what we can in the present moment to stop the wars, to press for justice, while also doing what we can to prepare the ground for the future. And that's in part why I work on common security alternatives. We can come to that later. So I'm going to go over a number of things fairly quickly, and then we'll have time in Q&A for you to press me on some of the things I've said or the things I've left out, and we'll see where that takes us. I begin with a set of kind of irony. We are in the post-colonial era, and we continue to feel the reverberations from that. And there is the now painful irony of Zionists in Israel, in a way, holding the bag for European colonialism. To remember that the settlement, the idea of creating a Jewish state, grows out of British colonialism. It was a way for Britain to actually increase its power at the time across the Middle East, and for Jews who were suffering pogroms and worse in Europe. It was theoretically a land without people for people without a land, but of course there were people in that land. Way back when, in 1981, I was part of a group that in Beirut that met with Yasser Arafat. It was not an inspiring meeting, but one thing that he said made total sense, which was that it's cowboys and Indians all over again. And to understand, Israel is a colonial settler state, not unlike the United States or Australia or South Africa. So we're dealing with these kinds of dynamics, and a part of which is racism, unfortunately, and the emergence of an apartheid state. An anecdote from way back when, which illuminates in a way why we're here. Again, I had the privilege early on of working with a man who had been Israel's number 3 general during the 67 war, and who was a fervent and very dedicated activist for a 2-state solution way back when. He was involved in the earliest negotiations with the PLO. And he told me a story. He said, in 1967, very shortly after the war, after the 6-Day War, he and Ezra Weitzman, who was the grandson of Israel's founder and the head of the Air Force, he and Weitzman were in East Jerusalem, which they just conquered, and Madi Peled, the general, turns to Weitzman and says, "Well, now we can settle the Palestinian problem and create a state on our own terms." And Weitzman turned to him and said, "What, are you crazy?" In that conversation, we have the vision of what was possible and the tragedy that it wasn't taken. There's so much that's anybody who's been listening to the news knows, and I'll run over some of those points. I'm Jewish, and for me, part of the tragedy here is that in many ways, the Zionist state has failed to apply lessons that should have been taken from the Holocaust, to treat the other with dignity, and to pursue a policy that allowed for self-determination for both people. And we part of the upshot of that is that Gaza has been essentially an open air prison now for the better part of since '67 in different ways, and there's been a blockade for 16 years, and the Hamas came to power in Gaza basically through two ways. Back when in ancient history, Menachem Begin, drawing from Marx, believed that religion was the opiate of the people, and a way to move Palestinian nationalists, secular nationalists, to undermine what was the PLO, was to allow Saudi money to come in, build mosques and build infrastructure. And in that, you had the initial foundation of Hamas. And as we all know, Netanyahu focused on expanding settlements and ultimate annexation of the West Bank, basically did his best on one hand to ignore, but also to let money flow from Qatar to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. A little bit in terms of the timing of this, you will have followed, at least from the corner of your eye, the process, building on the so-called Abraham Accords, the effort by Blinken and Biden to negotiate an Israeli, Saudi, and related Arab governments a normalization of relations, and from the Palestinian point of view, being increasingly marginalized, looking at the possibility that that marginalization could be powerfully reinforced by such an agreement. My belief is that we're encouraged by Iran, but Hamas moved to shatter that possibility, which at least for the time being they have done. So we have that. The horrors are just staggering, right? I mean, the cold-blooded massacres of October 7th. Even if one affirms the Palestinian right to self-determination and to overcome, the breakout, as one person described it, to do a jailbreak from Gaza. Nonetheless, I think we all recoil from such brutality, and obviously it has to be condemned and opposed. At the same time, I think and of course related to that, the taking of hostages, total violation of international law in both cases, and the law of war. But similarly, the death toll in Gaza now among civilians is over 5,000 civilians. It's a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel, and the level of rage is huge. The expectation is that Israel will essentially flatten northern Gaza, and then the anticipation here of a ground assault in what would be urban warfare. And sort of the assumption is that, well, once North Gaza is flattened, then it'll be easy for Israeli troops to go in. And not so. People I've been hearing and listening to are saying that the urban warfare amid the rubble will be just as deadly, not only for Palestinians, but also for Israeli troops. And look at more Israeli troops dead and more Israeli hostages taken. So there's a part of me that thinks that what is happening here, and I think Biden has been trying to warn Netanyahu and others about it, is that the Israelis may be moving into a Ben Laden-like trap, People are increasingly talking about a long war, and it just spells disaster. I mean, two other things to say about it before I move on is get my train of thought again. Yeah, I mean, there's we face the danger, and you can read about it in the daily newspapers. The possibility that this could widen, could become a regional war, right? There's the danger of Hezbollah coming in from the north, and then Israel responding as it will. Fighting a two-front war is militarily not easy. And there's also the danger, right, that in some ways Iran might join the fray, or Syria. If that happens, that also gives the Israelis the excuse to try to destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And we now have two U.S. aircraft carrier fleets, not just the aircraft carriers, but their fleets, at least 4,000 U.S. ground forces on those ships. And so the possibility this could become a really catastrophic regional war. We have to do what we can to oppose that. It's interesting, the polls I've seen in the last couple of days are saying that 2/3 of the U.S. people want a ceasefire, time to negotiate. Ultimately, the reality is that even if Hamas is destroyed, the ideology is going to remain, right? I mean, we still have to deal with Nazis in Europe and even Nazis here in the United States. So I don't know that I have all the answers, but I know that going deeper into the sandy version of deep muddy is not the answer. I guess also just to say, what they say, 20 trucks or so went in with aid today, and to appreciate that in the context of 2 million people, with 1.4 million now having been displaced for their homes, that is a drop in the bucket. And we're in a situation where, with the continuing cutoff of water, we face both people dying of dehydration and the possibility of cholera as people turn to other sources of water. The denial of electricity means that hospitals and water purification can't take place. And with the lack of fuel, there's the issues of, on the one hand, keeping the hospitals running, of transportation for those fleeing the north, and even that without fuel, how do you process the aid that comes in? So it's a nasty situation. And simply to say that, we do have increasing pressure, calling for a ceasefire and negotiations, not just a ceasefire, but a negotiating process, which would lead to ultimately to some form of either a two-state solution or some other form of mutual recognition, and allowing for self-determination of both peoples. I guess the last thing to say here, thinking in terms of immediate impact in our communities, is the not only the danger but the reality of growing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Back at the time of creation of Israel, Hannah Arendt, who's one of my great philosophical heroines, wrote that Jews internationally will be judged by what Israel does. Whether that's justified or not is another matter, but I think we already see that happening. And similarly, we have a long history of Western Islamophobia, and it has fertile ground here. And I think we are seeing and will continue to see more of that. So that's my quick and dirty there, and then I'm going to move on to some more less cheerful news. But this is the world we live in. So maybe a little more cheerful here. So I had this invitation to. I've been a part of the International Peace Bureau. I was for a period as vice president. I timed out. My term limit expired, but I continue to work closely with them. And growing out principally of International Peace Bureau, but with a lot of other related organizations, there was an international peace summit for Ukraine held in Vienna in June. And the goal was to press for ceasefire and negotiations. We were 300 people there from 32 countries. There was a lot of diversity. We had Russian critics of the war. We had Ukrainian opponents of both Russia's invasion, but also working for a ceasefire. And it was interesting. I mean, there were some differing perspectives for sure, but a somewhat unique ability of 300 people to work together respectfully. And out of that came the call for an International Week of Action, which took place now September 30th to October 8th. So we had that. I think I was particularly struck. One of the other Americans who was there was Ann Wright, who many of you likely know. Ann was a colonel in the U.S. military. She was a U.S. diplomat who resigned at the time of the Iraq invasion invasion of Iraq to express her opposition to it. And you know, when you've got a big event like that, you've got more than a little bit of rhetoric. And I will confess to being tired of hearing rhetoric. And Anne really cut through it all when she said, you know, to get to the Korean armistice, it took 500 meetings over 2 years. So even if we don't have a ceasefire now, and even if we think a ceasefire is a little bit inappropriate, it's important to begin the negotiations so we can get there. Maybe a couple other things to say here about the war, and I've been a part of a number of conversations. I've been remarkably privileged. You know, you will remember from Sesame Street, there's the routine about which one of these things is not the same. So I was invited into a track 2 process in which you have a number of current and former U.S. senior policymakers and scholars, European and diplomats, former arms control negotiators, their peers from Europe and from Russia. And you know, it covers an awful lot. It's confidential, so I can't even say who's in it. But it's been interesting. And from that and other conversations I've been a part of, you know, look, the war in Ukraine has hit a stalemate. We're in a situation where both the Ukrainians and the Russians are maintaining their maximal objectives and goals. The Russians, at least, to fully consolidate the 4 regions that they've annexed and maybe have a bit more influence. That they've yet to really articulate their specific goals, what victory for them would be like. And for Ukraine, there is the commitment to win back all of the territory that was Ukraine as of 1991, and that's not going to happen for either side. But they, for political and other reasons, they hold to it. You know, the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, has essentially failed, although they've sort of stymied the Russians a bit in the Black Sea. But what we see, unfortunately, I think, even with the congressional mess here in the United States and the inability to approve more money for weapons, it seems that both sides are at least holding out for the 2024 elections. I think the Russians are hoping that Trump will win and support for Ukraine will evaporate. And we may see some of that lessening in the struggle over the $106 billion arms and aid package. So we have that. Looking at, I mean, at the very beginning of the war, I don't always sign on with what Thomas Friedman writes in the Times, but early on in the war, he wrote that in the end, we're going to need to have a dirty deal. our peace movements and our commitments to justice, it's hard to accept a dirty deal. But in the end, as in the beginning, I think what we can see as a possible resolution here is Russia's continued hold on those regions that it has been able to implement its annexation of. It doesn't even need necessarily to be recognized diplomatically. There doesn't need to be an agreement or recognition by Ukraine of that. But that could simply become an issue that remains on the shelf. I was in a session this morning with Thomas Graham, who's a former arms control negotiator, and Anatole Levin of the Quincy Institute. And what they were saying is that a minimal expectation with a just and dirty deal would include that resolution in terms of the annexed areas, but with Ukraine still holding 80% of what it had in 1991, certainly not Crimea, which had been Russian since 1853 or so, but with Ukraine emerging as a neutral state. But one with very serious and credible international guarantees, a country which could join the European Union, for which is going to take a lot of changes in Ukraine to get there. And to appreciate, as Thomas Graham was saying, it's not going to be an instant process. The depths of corruption in Ukraine are huge. The oligarchs still have a lot of power. And so it's going to be a process that we'll have to, I would argue, we'll have to support over a period of time, and remembering how quickly we forget the victims of our wars or even our allies in wars. That's going to be, I think, something important for us. Then I'll jump to Asia somewhat quickly. I've had the privilege of working with peace advocates, peace forces, peace-oriented scholars in Asia and the Pacific for a long time. I have enormous respect for the law of unintended consequences. And in 1983, I ended up leading an opposition to an effort by Ronald Reagan and Senator Kennedy to turn Boston Harbor into a nuclear weapons base. There's a similar struggle out in San Francisco where David Hartsoe is. And we prevailed in both cases. And to my surprise, that led me to an invitation to go to Japan to the World Conference Against Anti-H Bombs. That was back in 1984. And so I've been back many times, and not that much longer after that, I ended up in Korea as well. So that's sort of why I have that base. So I was invited to come to Korea for essentially two events. There's a organization, it's principally a kind of a peace education, peace studies organization in South Korea called Peace Momo. And it grows out of the democracy movement in South Korea, which worked to and then succeeded in overcoming the military dictatorship that had been backed by the United States since 1945. And the focus, it was a small conference designed to explore what common security might look like in East Asia, with a particular focus on the Korean Peninsula. And I toured maybe about a year or so, 2 years ago, amidst the COVID, a really remarkable guy named Francis Duhan Lee. And Francis provides a lot of the intellectual leadership for Peace Momo. And out of that conference came an early warning call. The sense is that the tensions with the, on the one hand, the provocative US, Japanese, South Korean military exercises that are explicitly designed to not only conquer North Korea, but overthrow the Kim dynasty. And, the the North Korean development of its missile forces, its nuclear weapons, and their frequent exercises have created an extremely dangerous situation. And they're saying that even as we call for an end to the Korean War, which has an armistice, not a negotiated end, and for peace negotiations or peace system, that we have to be very concerned about the danger of an accident, a miscalculation, triggering a wider and absolutely disastrous Korean War. I mean, what 1/3 of the population of South Korea lives in Seoul, which is within artillery distance, not to mention rocket distance from North Korea. One of the takeaways from that conference and my learnings there were the increasing institutionalization of two competing trilateral alliances. On the U.S. side, and we saw it with the recent summit between Biden, Kishida from Japan, and Yoon from South Korea. We have an intensifying military alliance between these three countries, which of course also relate to India, Australia, and so on. And on the other side, you have the deepening, not a formal alliance, but deepening military collaborations between China, Russia, and North Korea. And we just saw the Russian North Korean alliance deepening. Each of these alliances has its fault lines. For the Southern alliance, Japanese-Korean tensions remain. The historic question from the colonialization and the war. And on the northern side, there remain a number of contradictions between Russia and China, right? There's a lot of Russian land that used to be Chinese. And in the recent drawing of the Chinese 10 dot line, it also included a claim for one of the Russian islands. The other piece that was there, and I need to watch the time here, was I had the really extraordinary honor of being invited to the ceremony at the DMZ, the 38th parallel, to mark the 70th anniversary. And a very solemn affair, a call for peace, for declaration of the end of the war, for negotiations, for demilitarization. And it's interesting. I mean, the Korean peace movement has deep roots, among others, in the Catholic Church and among Christians in South Korea. It's different from our movement here. And then finally, to say a little bit about Japan, I'm going to say a lot. This was really the first major conference that their peace movement had been able to hold since COVID. And to appreciate that, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the annual holding of the World Conference Against A&H Bombs, it is a social movement. It is part of Japanese identity. You have petitions and statements which are for nuclear disarmament, for Japan to sign on to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, signed by the majority of governors and the majority of mayors across the country. So it's there. But at the same time, you have a government which is increasingly militarized. It's already the 6th biggest military spender, and the Kishida government has committed to doubling that military spending. So it's not a good situation. There are some heartbreaking elements here where the hibakusha, the A-bomb survivors, are getting old. I mean, the average age is well into the 80s, and even as Japanese have long lifespans, these are courageous people who are nearing the end of their lives. For them, the negotiation of the TPNW was just an absolute fantastic breakthrough. So we had that, and we had some wonderful talks, not only by the hibakusha, but much of the Japanese movement is focused on the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and trying to move their government to at least send observers to the second meeting of states parties, which will be held in New York in November. And the reality is that I was just speaking with Setsuko Thurlow the other day. She's among the most courageous of the Hibakusha and nearing the end of her life. The outrage, for example, that the mayor of Hiroshima, who used to be in the Japanese Foreign Ministry, signed an agreement making a partnership between Hiroshima and Pearl Harbor as historical sites, as if in a way legitimizing the idea that Hiroshima was A-bombed in response to Pearl Harbor. So that was a big part of it. We did a lot of preparation for the events that'll take place at the time of the TPNW in basically the week after Thanksgiving. And I'll just say that as I wrap up here, that I'm involved in organizing 2 events in New York, both of which I believe will be live streamed. One is we're pulling together a small group of nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament experts, arms control experts, and national movement leaders. At the moment, it'll be small, about 30 people. At this point, we have people from 13 countries, including Israel and Iran. And then we have a public meeting on the 29th, where Setsuko will be speaking, Imad Kaye from Iran, Jackie Cabasso from California, great analyst, Rainer Braun from Germany, and Molly McGinty from IPGNW. And as I can catch my breath, I'll put a couple of URLs in the chat so you can find your way to them. So only a couple minutes over time, and I'll wet my whistle here.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, you take a second here while I tell people. As you can tell, and many of you already knew, Joseph is a wealth of information and experience about so much going on in the world. So we're going to do some questions. There's already a few things in the chat that I can put out there. Mostly, you can raise your hand if you'd really like to speak. I will tell you that I have asked Joseph to stay a little late after our formal end, so for further conversation then. So don't worry too much. I think we'll get to everyone, but let me start with these notes in the chat. Okay. So first was Jerry. Jerry asked, how about setting up a refugee camp just to the east of Gaza with tight controls on access and egress? Let the non-combatants, to the degree they can be identified, go into the refugee camp. Eventually, only Hamas and hostages would be left in Gaza, then go after them. Is that, I guess he wants your opinion on that.
Yeah, so it has a lot of logic, but there's also the logic of the Middle East. East of Gaza is where? In Israel? At this point, with the rage directed at Palestinians and really the racism, the last thing I think we can expect is that Israel would welcome refugees in significant numbers into Israel. I mean, at the moment, just appreciate the siege that's going on. The bombings. I mean, there's even been bombings of people in southern Gaza who had come from the north. So even and the other place for such logic, would be to the west in the Sinai. But there, the Egyptians are concerned on the one hand that some in Hamas would come through. Hamas is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a profound enemy of the Sisi dictatorship, and on the other hand, the Egyptians don't want to be held accountable for solving the Palestinian problem without a Palestinian state. So I think neither of those are going to fly.
Thanks for speaking to that. I want to get this other, well, here, I'm a little out of order, but Arnie is asking if you could say more about China and the ramping up of anti-China sentiment as a bipartisan sentiment in the US.
Yeah, there is, I would say, madness in Washington, which in turn, and we had a fair bit of it, from Trump, but it goes back. I mean, the reality is that, well, I'll just say something controversial here. While the European theater of World War II was around Nazism and a degree of democracy, in Asia, it was a competition between three empires, between the British Empire, the United States, and the Japanese Empire. And there's a long history, leading up to that. And I won't go into great detail. At the end of the war, obviously, the United States prevailed. The Pacific became what was called an American lake. And the United States, with the exception after 1949, with the Chinese Revolution, it was the hegemonic power in the region, right? And you have a long history here, manifest destiny and so on. So that whole region was essentially a part of, with a few small exceptions, part of the American Empire. And our assumption is that the assumption of our leadership is that we continue to dominate. I mean, way back when, in 1968, I had a course on U.S. diplomatic history, and the professor explained to us how in the 1890s we had a Great Depression here, and the masters of capital understood that if they wanted to, and they also had a lot of labor protests and efforts to unionize. And so big capital understood that if the U.S. could win access to the China market with all those millions of people, even then, that it could keep our factories running 24/7, keep our workers employed and happy, and the owners of capital making more money. And to do that, the United States conquered the Philippines, Guam, Samoa, stepping stones to that market, and then with the open door policy, we got our share of it. So there's a long history here. You have a long history of racism against Asian Americans. You saw that in the Exclusion Act, in the in immigration policies, in riots in which Asian Americans were killed. So that's unfortunately, a deep part of our culture. So now you have the shock of China rising. And if you are, and not to speak here about issues of justice within China, which is increasingly a totalitarian state, but nonetheless, their leadership believes that their role is to assume what has long been China's historic role. I mean, through most of recorded history, China was the leading nation in the world, the most advanced nation in the world. And the reality, and we see this in Israel too, is that trauma does not necessarily generate moral leadership or great sensitivities. So for the Chinese, who, I mean, look, they lost the war so that the British could market opium, make their people addicted in order to address Britain's imbalance of payments problems. Here in the United States, the Vassars, John Kerry, who's a Vanderbilt, that money was in part built on the opium trade. We didn't have the Indian opium; we had the Turkish opium. So if you're a Chinese intellectual or Chinese leader, you're dealing with the reality of coming out of what they see as 150 years of humiliation. they want to assume their rightful place. Among other things, their rightful place, to their mind, includes the reunification of Taiwan, which was taken from them by Japan in 1895. And in their own version of imperialism, they're now claiming, 80 to 90% of the South China Sea at the expense of other countries, right? That had been the American lake, and now the Chinese want to take a part of it away. So you have, what Graham Allison at Harvard described as a Thucydides trap. You have the classical tensions between rising and declining powers, right? I mean, and they, from the Chinese elite position, they see the United States as a declining power, and Lord knows what's happening in the House of Representatives would certainly encourage that thinking. So we have that. And with China's economic growth, I mean, this fantastic growth. I mean, no country in the world has grown that big that fast. It transformed itself. The race for building a military that can keep the United States away from its coasts, and we're in a. It is interesting when Arnie has heard this before. When I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I went there with competing ambitions. I wanted to be a freedom rider in the civil rights movement, and I wanted to be a diplomat. And I learned early on that I couldn't be a diplomat for this country. But we had a course that was designed to mold our thinking called The Evolution of Civilizations. And on the first day of the class, the professor says that when he gives a question asking you to evaluate a civilization or competition with civilizations, you have to answer it on the basis of 6 interrelated forces within the society: military, political, economic, social, intellectual, and spiritual. I still remember it, right? And as he said, different periods of history, one of those may be at the cutting edge, right? And in this period of time, it's technology that's at the cutting edge. Technology obviously requires an economic foundation, requires an intellectual foundation. But in terms of military, the whole struggle here is around who's got the most advanced technology. So you have this going on in a situation of what's the word I want? I'm forgetting the concept I want. But basically, where there's a sense of shock from the, I think, major sectors of the U.S. Elite and opinion makers, that here is China challenging us, a largely white Christian manifest destiny country. And so, we have to hold on to our power. I mean, just think in terms of the, what's happening domestically here, in terms of trying to, America first, American dominates, still the commitment to a unipolar world. So it's a manifestation of that. And, racism plays a big part of it, I'm afraid. There are alternatives. I mean, one of the things that we need to talk about, I'm sorry I'm talking so fast here, I really haven't taken the speed. What we need to deal with is that while this competition is going on, with enormous investments in military equipment and social mobilization, we have the increasing existential threat of the climate emergency, and we have a mutual need, the Chinese as well as the Americans and the rest of the world, to stanch this. So we have our small little committee for a sane U.S.-China policy, and we work with others working for common security, win-win diplomacy. Mr. Margaret Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, was in China this summer, and hard-boiled negotiations. But as she was leaving, she said, "Look, the world is big enough for the United States and China," and I think we need, we need to be talking about that. We need to explore ways of cooperating, even as our systems are so totally different. Yeah, but when we talk about repression in Xinjiang or what's happened in Hong Kong, they point to 2 million people in our prisons. They point to the gun violence. I mean, if you travel outside the United States and you listen to people, the first thing they think about when they hear the United States is mass shootings, the guns. Is it even safe to travel to the United States? I'm not a particularly religious person, but there is, I think, from Proverbs about taking the mote out of your eye before you reach for it in the other person's eye. And a little bit of humility on our side would go a long way.
Okay, Joseph, thank you. Okay. David, I would love for you to unmute and go ahead.
Thank you, Joseph. You just mentioned common security. I was interested in your travels in the various conflict areas. How much interest is there among both the activists and non-governmental people, et cetera, in common security, as opposed to each side preparing for more war?
Mhm.
It just seems so natural. Wars have not worked hardly anywhere that I know about in decades. And I know that's part of who you are, is common security. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts, both whether there's interest within these other in the conflict areas, and also, is there any potential for governments beginning to see the light that there's more effective ways to get security for their people?
Okay, so let me just begin. Thank you, David. Let me just begin with a reference, because many people don't know what common security is. So at the height of the Cold War and the arms races in the very early 1980s, Olof Palme, who was then the Prime Minister of Sweden, brought together very senior figures from the United States, from the Soviet Union, and from Europe, including Cyrus Vance, who had been U.S. Secretary of State, Georgy Arbatov, who was Gorbachev's principal military advisor. We had a spiraling arms race, and it was increasingly dangerous. And they had hard and difficult discussions, but what they came to, the obvious conclusion, was that when one country increases its military capacity, a rival, the other is fearful of that, and it increases its military. You have a spiraling up. And how do you spiral down? So what you do is to have the difficult negotiations in which each side names what the other is doing that causes the greatest fear and insecurity. And then you explore ways to remove that threat in ways that don't decrease the security of the other side. I mean, the basic piece here is that if you want to have, you can only make peace with your rival and not against your rival. And that applies to almost all situations. And I think it applies domestically as well. So then, to answer David's question, the reality is that in the post-Cold War period, it was largely forgotten. And as we've now had the expansion of NATO and the Ukraine war, there's a lot of doubts about it. But what's interesting, what I find, is that I'm working closely with people in Europe who are working to promote common security. I was having difficulty with my part of the chat, but just over a year ago, we produced this report, which you can find at commonsecurity.org, which lays out a lot of foundations. And in the Peace Summit in Vienna, and a number of other occasions, you find certainly the European peace movement, and to some extent U.S. peace movement, increasingly making reference to common security. I'm involved in a project. I'm just really privileged with some of the people that I get to work with. So I'm working with a group of movement leaders and really fine, engaged scholars from across Asia in working to develop a vision of what common security would be in Asia. Going into particulars, not only the values, but what would it mean in relationship to Taiwan? What would it mean in relationship to the South China West Philippine Sea? What would it mean in terms of nuclear weapons? As this morning in a meeting we had, a planning meeting, in Asia, the perception is that common security is a European concept and totally new there. And so we're working to develop that vision. I will say that one of the biggest challenges we have is the degree of repression now in Xi Jinping's China. So a number of people who have been our partners in the past or who we'd like to have as partners are keeping their heads down. So that makes our work a little bit more difficult. But you plant the seeds and you see where they go, and there's still quite a number of Chinese scholars and students and others, business people here in the United States. So maybe we make some inroads that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Joseph. I'm going to wrap up the official part of our program. Like I said, Joseph, I think you're willing to stay after a little bit. Okay, so those of you with the hands up, if you can hang in, we'll get to you. But for those who, we promised this be an hour, so we'll do an official end here. I'm putting some things in the chat, and I'm going to